Hey, what's up, everyone? Dragon back again here to tell you that you should be watching Spaced. So, Spaced is a 1999 British sitcom written and directed by Edgar Wright and featuring Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, and Jessica Stevenson, and basically kind of follows these characters as they move into like this London flat for, all my Americans out there. That's an apartment. Which is pretty much the only place in the world I think that doesn't call it a flat is America, but we like to do things differently here for whatever reason. Anyway, so the story on its surface seems pretty mundane. They kind of move in, they don't know each other. They just they're both getting out of relationships. They just kind of both need a place to live because essentially they're not going to be having any place to live. They're kind of semi-professional adults. She's kind of works as like a columnist. He's a comic book artist. So it basically kind of follows kind of the hijinks of these two kind of moving it together and all their weird friends. And on the surface, that sounds pretty normal, pretty mundane. What makes this show interesting, though, is the fact that it leans heavily on kind of pop culture references, dare I even say early geek culture. And that's kind of what the crux of this show is about. Now, normally I kind of give you more of a rundown of the plot and what it's really about, and then I kind of go into the allegory of what these things are. But the reality is, this show on its own really isn't about anything. It is the allegory. The show is essentially an allegory. And what makes this show very interesting is that it was basically celebrating geek culture as we now know it long before it was cool to do that. This is in the days when you were still getting, beaten up at school for like reading comic books or playing Dungeons and Dragons. Like if someone found out that, you read manga, which if you were in America, that was a very rare thing to do. Or, again, if you collected comic books, you played Magic the Gathering, that kind of stuff, or really into like, video games and JRPGs, all that, you're probably getting your ass beat a lot. I was a little bit bigger, so I kind of was able to avoid some of that. But, it wasn't cool to be a geek. And in this show, it kind of celebrates that. It kind of shows like these guys are comic book nerds, they play video games, and the show goes as so far as to basically kind of take the events that are happening in their lives and kind of almost make them parodies of what they'll do in like video games. There's a great scene where Tim and Daisy are kind of like arguing with each other, and it's interwoven with like a fight in Tekken. It's like when he gets a jab at her, his character in Tekken gets a hit, and vice versa. And it's just kind of funny the way they did that kind of stuff. Whereas if you're watching now as a modern audience, you wouldn't really think much of it. The only thing you might gripe about is like, oh, that's such an old game. You know what I mean? But which at the time was such a big deal because it was in 3D. But yeah, and that's the thing. But when you think about it, the late 90s up to 2001, that wasn't really a thing. It wasn't something that was cool to do, popular to do. So in a strange way, this story, this show kind of maybe in a way foresaw, the kind of the cultural landscape that was to come. So when you look at what it kind of maybe celebrate, how it approached the material, you realize that, perhaps in a lot of ways, this was an influence on a lot of other things today. I mean, it was a British show, so it didn't technically come over here. I mean, if you had like, BBC America, that's, I'm sure you saw it. I mean, it's been made to, it's been released in the States on like DVD and whatnot. Still waiting for that Blu-ray release. But since then, I've talked to a lot of people who have watched the show, and I've seen a lot of people in interviews, in the media who are familiar with it and who love that show. And it kind of makes you wonder that now when you see that geek culture is so prevalent in mainstream media, the people who are producing this material, there are probably people who watched this show, who are familiar with this show and really loved it, and perhaps they themselves were just basically big nerds too. But now that they can capitalize on it, they can kind of openly, wear their geek pride, as a badge of honor. Whereas before, maybe even if they're working in Hollywood or television or whatever, they kind of kept it more to themselves and just kind of, played it straight in terms of the mainstream media. But now that is mainstream, and now that comic book movies make billions of dollars at the box office, now that kind of thing is cool, these people who work in the industry who have, were influenced by not only their own personal, interest within video games and comic books and whatnot, but now that they maybe had watched a show that kind of made them feel like it was cool to be a geek, that it was something to be proud of, that perhaps that was kind of a push for them to look into these other kind of forms, these other mediums of entertainment to hopefully see if they can make a successful transition into the mainstream, which now we've seen that they have. So when you watch a show like Spaced and you see that they just freely reference, video games, TV shows. I mean, you have Babylon 5 references in this show, which I don't know if any of you guys remember Babylon 5, but if you were, watching science fiction, television, or film in the 90s, Babylon 5 was a big deal. And that's kind of the interesting thing is that, and I actually used to know people who got made fun of watching Babylon 5, and a few times I could hear a few snide remarks directed towards me back in the 90s when I would say, yeah, I watched Babylon 5, and you hear and again, that was normal back then, whereas now if you mention, let me put it in perspective. Imagine saying you watch Stranger Things and someone makes fun of you for that. It would be unheard of now, but back then, a show like that would have been treated like that by the mainstream. It wouldn't have been as popular. It wouldn't have been as well received by the masses because that whole show is basically, not to get off this show, is a big homage to, 80s nerd culture, so to speak. In a lot of ways, science fiction, and now it's super cool. Back then, not so much. Same thing with this show. It was kind of doing that when it was not cool to do that. And in a weird way, kind of made it cool because then a lot of people really responded to the material and really enjoyed the show. So much so then they're kind of start to look into these references, look into what this show was kind of referencing and talking about, and maybe saying, well, maybe it's not so dumb to like video games and comic books. I'm not saying everyone felt that way, but it wasn't, you didn't have the mainstream jock, talking about his favorite X-Men character. I mean, it wasn't cool like it is now. I mean, sure, I like that kind of stuff, and I'm sure a lot of you guys did too. But we were the minority, and that's the way it was back then. So a show like this was very much kind of like, the flag waver saying, we're here, we're proud, and we're not going to be ashamed of this stuff. And we're just going to say, who cares what people think? Who cares if people laugh at us? Let's just have fun with this and make this a really fun show. And that's what they did. The show is hilarious. The writing is great. If some of these names sound familiar, like Edgar Wright, Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, these are the guys kind of responsible for like Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, those kinds of things. So you're probably, if you're not familiar with this show, you're probably familiar with their other work, their more mainstream stuff. But, at the end of the day, this is kind of what got them going. In terms of the British market, this is where a lot of people learned about them, found out about them, and fell in love with them. And then American audiences kind of, discover them through their feature film work. But, that's really the basic crux of the story. And there's a great cast of characters, all the weird, quirky neighbors and friends that come to visit. And it's such a eclectic bunch, and it's so strange, but it's also to use a British term, it's brilliant. It's so well written, but again, if you describe the show to someone, it might sound kind of boring, it might sound kind of mundane, and it almost might kind of sound cliche by this point. But that's kind of the point. The fact that it might sound cliche to you now kind of means that the show is a success. It kind of succeeded in doing what it wanted to do, which was normalizing that which was once considered strange. Normalizing people that would have once been considered strange. And that's kind of, it kind of shows you how far we've come, so to speak. Not to add like a kind of social, political, tint to it or anything. But again, the fact that now, you can read your favorite issue of Iron Man openly in school and not get your, underwear run up a flagpole or get a swirly from the quarterback. And again, I know, it doesn't always happen like that. It wasn't always like that for everyone. But the point is, you really won't see it happen anymore at all. Whereas once upon a time, that could happen. And that show basically said that it wanted to remove that stigma. It wanted to get rid of this idea that people who are not necessarily into sports, even though they're big into, Simon Pegg's character is big into like X Games stuff and skateboarding, but who are not necessarily into mainstream entertainment, that doesn't mean they're like these social outcasts. Doesn't mean like they're these misfits. Doesn't mean they're living in their mother's basement. It's trying to break the stereotypes and just kind of show them that these people are cool in their own right, and they don't give a damn what you think about them. This is what they like. This is what they're into, and they're gonna go. And that it's cool to be weird. It's cool to be different. And these guys are really weird, and they're very different, and you love them for it. The things that you shouldn't like them for, because it's not considered normal, is what really makes these characters endearing. So again, on the surface, It's not Shakespeare. It's not some deep, introspective, look into the human condition. It's not a in-depth character study on anyone, but it's kind of just a celebration of passion, of what you like, and basically kind of looking at life through the lens of people who love these kinds of things and kind of how they interpret the world through the lens of, their kind of social pop culture kind of bubble, if you will. Yeah. So, and it's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't feel, you don't feel excluded. If you're not familiar with this kind of stuff, if you're not a geek, so to speak, you won't watch this and feel like it's not for you. Like you don't get it. There'll be references that maybe you don't understand, but they kind of explain what the references are. They almost kind of set up the references. So if you don't know much about video games or Babylon 5 or Star Wars, this is when like season 2 is when like after the Phantom Menace came out. So when everyone went the backlash for that movie, they address it in this show, and there's like a great whole like arc with like Simon Pegg's character dealing with his almost like his breakup with Star Wars, like he's breaking up with like a long-term relationship, and it's just really funny how they handle that. But that's the thing, they set up the reference, they kind of explain to you what these things are, why they love them so much, and what are kind of the trademark elements of them. So when they make the joke, when they make the reference, you now get it. So it doesn't feel like it's excluding anyone. If anything, it feels like it's inviting you in. It feels very inclusive. So if you're not familiar with this kind of stuff, this is maybe a great show to kind of understand why people like me think it's so damn cool. And if you love it and you haven't seen this show, then check out this show because you really will enjoy it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you haven't already, I recommend Spaced. I know a lot of people have now since seen it with the internet, so I'd be, and plus with like Simon Pegg blowing up so big now, being in big major blockbuster films and what have you, writing, if you follow him, you more than likely have kind of discovered this show. But if you haven't, go check it out. I'll leave some, links in the description section below where you can pick it up. Check it out, come back, leave me some comments. If you have seen it, let me know what you think. Do you kind of agree that it was a precursor to maybe other shows and films that celebrate this kind of thing? Do you feel it did it better than what it's doing now? Do you feel there are others that maybe have kind of taken up the mantle and kind of run with it? I don't know. Give me some of your thoughts. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this one. So we'll check you out on the next one, guys. Thanks for watching. Peace!